And today we're going to start with dear friend of mine, Dan Kuehl. Many of you know he sorted out and made the first IW program at National Defense University. He dragged me in, God, what year was it, 94, Dan?
94. 94.
And it was, when talk about IW, it was like, the military people, I made this shit up. I have no clue. And I was scared out of my mind when I started doing these presentations for Dan. And we've ended up with InfoWarCon over the years doing some great stuff. And so,
of course, we were making it up too.
yeah, but you guys, were supposed to be the authorities. I was just some schmuck who wrote a book. That was all. I didn't know anything. So Dan has been involved in education very heavily, and we were touching on yesterday some of the IA issues, skirting around education. And one of the things I asked Dan to talk about was the state of education, because we've got the problems in the private sector and the government sector. So at this point, I'm going to hand it over to Dan Kuehl. Dan, thank you so much for being here. Wish you were here. We all understand. I'm handing it over to you.
All right, Wynn, thank you. Some of you will recognize some of the slides I'm going to show because I've used them for a while. But what really often surprises me is how often people have never seen them before, which is just a sign of the influx of people coming into, I'll call it, this field. If Betty has the title slide up there,
I did.
I call this an information strategy, and I'm going to lay out for you in a couple minutes what I think should be in a national information strategy and why I think it needs to be part of a national security strategy. In what I always tell my students is the most important word I use with them, interconnected, because I think it is the interconnectedness of the world, and what we're doing right now is a wonderful example of that interconnectivity that's changing the world. Okay, next slide. As my one pathetic attempt at humor, I'm going to attempt to move you from the left-hand column, meaning Wynn's house, over into the right-hand column, which still may mean in Wynn's house. I'm not sure how much booze he laid on for all this, but you should start right now. And let's go to the slide that says target list, because there's three things that I want to do. I want to talk about information briefly, and I want to explain the concepts that I have for information as an element of national power. I want to talk about cyberspace and the cyber domain as different from the information environment and how that all plays into national security strategy. And then I want to talk a little bit about information and especially the educational piece that I promised Wynn I would touch on, because I think that there are some things that we do very, very well, and there are some things that we are doing abysmally poorly at, and unfortunately the parts we're doing the worst on are the most important parts, in my opinion. Okay, let's go to the next slide. It says Paradigm K. If we go back to those mid-90s, as Wynn was talking about, back at the School of Information Warfare and Strategy at NDU, I don't know that we were making this stuff up, but we were still intellectually grappling, we still are, with what this all meant and how we could capture it and how we could portray it in a format that would be useful to students and above. And I created this building block you see here, this Venn diagram, which really builds from the bottom up. At the bottom was a term that some of you will probably still recognize: command and control warfare, C2W. And I've always argued that C2W was the military building block for everything that came afterwards, because it's the stuff that the militaries of the world, not just ours, yours as well, and Sweden and our other NATO and bilateral allies and maybe some of our adversaries, recognize very clearly the things that we need to be good at: electronic warfare, psychological operations, or what we're now calling MESO, things like that, things that serve us good old-fashioned blast, heat, fragmentation, and warfare. But I've always wanted to argue that C2W was a building block to something larger, and I use the term that has gone out of favor in the DoD since then: information warfare, which focuses on the military use of this stuff, military operations offensively and defensively, and that in turn is a subset of what we've come to term information operations. which actually has started out 10 years ago. Information operations was a broader concept, I believe, that it has narrowed down to now. But what I really want to focus on is the big box that's around everything: information power, national level aggregation, the national level correlation of other elements of national power, economic, military, diplomatic, things that the civilian world is deeply involved in, to provide the nation state with the ability to use information as an element of power to support our security objectives. Next slide. DIME. There are a lot of different ways of capturing elements of national power, and this is not right. It's just the way that we have used it at National Defense University for the past 10 years, and that I'm comfortable with. And depending upon where you are, the different elements of DIME, whether it's diplomatic or informational or military or economic, will be more heavily emphasized than others. If we look at economic power, the relationship between it and information power was clearly recognized even as far back as the Reagan administration in the 1980s. If you look at political or diplomatic power, Radio Free Europe, the War of Ideas, stuff that we talked about in the 1980s and earlier than that. The synergy between information power and diplomatic political power is clear. It's there for all to see. Obviously, military. From the Russian concept of the military techno revolution, what we started calling the revolution in military affairs back in the 90s, what a while ago we were calling defense transformation, and I don't know what we're going to call it now. Secretary Hagel will probably come up with a new term for it. I want to argue that information power, while it is separate and distinct from and identifiable from and definable in comparison to other elements of national power, military, diplomatic, economic, it is deeply embedded within those and enables and supports all of those. But there's questions we have to pose. How well are these incorporated and integrated across the Department of Defense? How well integrated and supported are they across the United States government? How do we engage the interagency, for example, to do this? How well do we partner with our coalition partners and our allies and bilateral allies all over the world? And how do we and how do others incorporate this into national security strategies? Betty, if you go to the next slide. What is information power? A good 10+ years ago, as Wynn says, when we were wrestling with this, I tried to argue that if information power is the use of information, content, and the technology that delivers that content, which I'm going to call connectivity in a minute. We use them as strategic instruments on a global basis to affect global behaviors. And another way of looking at it, we're all familiar in this audience, especially the national security community that's represented here. We're all aware of and comfortable with land power, air power, sea power. Okay. If you go back and talk to those guys that wrote the Bibles on land power and sea power and air power, Giulio Douay, Alfred Thayer Mahan, etc., they took a fairly simple approach towards it. And their argument was, if I can use that environment for my benefit and to prevent an adversary from using it, that sounds like power. And so another way of looking at information power is the ability to use the information environment. Now, this may sound fairly nebulous, but it's not. There are ways of counting and tabulating and quantifying that power. And I'll get to them in more detail in a minute. Two of them are, in my opinion, clearly measurable. Connectivity, how well we link together people and organizations and countries to share information. And then the content, what gets exchanged through that connectivity. And the bottom line of all this is, what impact does it have and how effective is it? Let's go to the next slide. I've been writing about the information environment for 15 years now, and the approach I try to take towards it is of, my students know this by heart, Dan's 3 C's. C1 is connectivity, and that is nothing more complicated than the ability to link together human beings, people, organizations, militaries, countries, so that that connectivity enables them to use the second C, and that's the content. And that is what we build and what we create. It can be words, it can be images, it can be databases, string of ones and zeros. It certainly can be actions, deeds. Deeds are a form of content, and also, in fact, things that you don't do are a form of content. But the most important C, and the one that's the hardest to measure, is the third one, the cognitive impact. We use connectivity to deliver content so we can affect human cognition, because the cognition then affects how we think and behave and decide and act, etc. Very quickly, go to the next slide. I'll go through the next 3 slides quickly here. Connectivity, the ability to transmit or receive information. It includes human connectivity. One of the things that has been going on at Wynn's house for the past 24 hours is a whole heck of a lot of connectivity being exploited. And what's everyone doing? They're exchanging content. Go to the next slide. The slide says content. The connectivity enables us to exchange content. And with that, I affect how you think and believe and behave, and you, in turn, affect how I think and behave and believe. It's also tied up with a bunch of other things like credibility and context, and those things are vitally important. The more credible you are, the greater likelihood you have that whatever content you're delivering to someone, person, organization, entire society, country, the greater your credibility, the more believable that content is, and the more likely you are to have the cognitive impact that you want to have. And there's some pictures on that slide there. One of the Saddam statue coming down in Baghdad way back in 2003. There's a little picture beneath it of an American hospital ship. It gives us comfort or something. Which we send that thing out to South America, to the Far East, taking American medical care to places that don't have it. That ship, with the great big red cross painted on the side and the great big American flag on it, that ship is a form of content. And of course, what the people on board that ship do, the doctors, the nurses, the medical personnel, the care that they provide to people in the Philippines or in South America, those actions are content. And let's go to the last one, the cognitive impact. Next slide. In some ways, that's the hardest one, because how do you measure this? How do we measure cognitive impact? There are ways of doing it, and I'm going to suggest for you that all 3 of these C's, connectivity, content, cognitive impact, are done better by the private sector than they are done by the government. This is one of the reasons why I think those of you who know me have heard me argue this for years, and I think this audience of Wynn's is probably particularly in agreement with it, that the private sector is the most important part of this. The private sector is the best at building connectivity. The private sector is the best at developing content, and the private sector is the best at measuring the cognitive impact, to examining behavior and how attitudes change and how behaviors change in response to the attitudes, because you can observe behavior. You can measure the difference between behavior 1, before your content was delivered, and behavior 2, what happens afterwards. You have some degree of measurement there of what kind of impact that content has had, and that thing gives you a bit of a measurement of the cognitive. Okay, let's go to the next slide very briefly, because I do want to touch upon cyberspace. There's a great distinction. There's a strong distinction between cyberspace and information. too many people, I think, try to blend them together or equate them, and they're not. They're not the same. They on the left-hand side of that slide is the official DoD definition of cyberspace. On the right-hand side of the slide is the definition that I wrote for a book that we published at NDU a couple of years ago. And it starts out with, and I've emphasized this, a global cyberspace is a global domain within the information environment. There's two very important pieces to the way those definitions start out. One, a domain. The American Department of Defense has put a stake in the sand that cyberspace is a place where we operate for national security purposes. There's the air domain, there's the land, there's the sea, there's outer space, and there's cyberspace. So we have 5 physical domains in which we operate. And yet, remember it says within the information environment, cyberspace is a subset of the information environment that we've been talking about for the past couple of minutes here. Let's go to the next slide. That domain word is very important, especially in the United States military, because domains are how we organize armed forces. Armies operate on the land domain, Air Forces in the air domain, navies in the naval domain. Outer space is a domain in which a growing number of countries and militaries operate right now, and then, of course, there's cyberspace as the 5th one. The information is not a physical domain. It is an operational environment. Let's go to the next slide. I use my famous elephant. Many of you have heard either me or someone else tell the story of the 5 blind Indians who were brought to the elephant and asked to describe the elephant. Well, they could each describe in some degree of detail the one piece of the elephant that they were able to physically handle. So one grabs the trunk and says, "Oh, an elephant is like a huge muscle." One grabs the tail. An elephant is like a small whip. One grabs an ear. An elephant is like a huge leaf flapping, in the wind. One puts his hand against the side of the elephant and says, "Oh, an elephant is like a wall." One grabs a leg. An elephant is like a tree. Well, every single one of them was exactly right in describing their particular piece of the elephant. They are completely and utterly wrong to say this is the whole elephant. And this is the problem that we in the American military have had and continue to have, and I would wager that some of yours do as well, is that we tend to try to describe the elephant, the information environment, cyberspace, in terms of the one particular piece that we have a hold of and that we deal with. And so what has happened over the years is that the various communities, you see some of them on the left, cyberspace, information operations, electronic warfare, psychological operations, or MISO, tend to view their community as this is the real information operation. For several years I've tried to argue against that and argue that no, they're nested within each other. And yet, there was a couple of my students, actually a whole class full of my students about 4 years ago, we were discussing this in class back at NDU. And they made the suggestion, which I learned more from my students than I ever gave to them, that they nest together, but in different degrees and different amounts depending upon the different circumstances of what's going on. We have electromagnetic pulse and directed energy, which, if you use the approach that I'm going to try to make towards cyberspace as being the electromagnetic spectrum, those kinds of things are clearly cyber, because cyber is defined by the electromagnetic spectrum. And yet there are other things done for information operations which are outside of the cyber or electromagnetic realm. but they're clearly information operations. And so how these things nest together varies depending upon the context of what is happening. And so it's going to depend upon what the details are of how we describe the cyber environment. In fact, I'm going to argue, is cyberspace the domain, or is the electromagnetic spectrum actually the domain? That's the argument that I have come to over the past several years. Betty, next slide. And to stay on the military and to stay on the national security pieces for a few more minutes. Cyber warfare. There's a fair degree of continuity between the approaches taken by the American Department of Defense and by the Russian MOD, because we both try to place cyber war flat, square within the basket of other forms of armed conflict, other forms of warfare. And I fundamentally agree with this approach. Cyber war is not 6 kids in a garage doing something. They may do something harmful, they may do something very negative, but that's not cyber war. Not unless they're doing it under the direction of military authorities for the furtherance of military objectives. And so I think there's some continuity between ourselves and the Russians and others as well. And you can discuss this amongst yourselves. I hope you do, about the how we define cyber war and how it relates to the other things that we do. Next slide, Betty. General Cartwright, who is now retired, I think is one of the more profound thinkers on this. When he was the commander of the United States Strategic Command, which at that point owned information and operations back about 6 years ago, said, if we apply the principles of warfare to the cyber domain as we do to sea, air, and land, we realize the defense of the nation is better served by capabilities enabling us to take the fight to our adversaries when necessary. What he's laying out there really is one of the fundamental reasons why we created the United States Strategic Cyber Command, was to put offense and defense in the same organization and responsible to the same commander, which I think is the right way to do things. I realize not everyone thinks that, and there's an ongoing debate within the American military, within the American government, about cyberspace and warfare and the role of the NSA. You've probably already talked about this. In the role of U.S. Cyber Command, and whether the commander of Cyber Command should be also the head of NSA. That's an argument that I can't settle myself, but I hope you'll talk about it here at the conference. Let's go to the next slide briefly, because I wanted to tie this to national security strategy. When the Obama administration 4 years ago issued in 2010 its national security strategy, there's a fair amount of emphasis, not surprisingly, in that strategy on economics. What was striking was that there was no apparent linkage in the strategy between cyber and economics. There was a fair amount in the security strategy there is on cybersecurity. 1 or 2 pages in the strategy and several paragraphs devoted to it. And cybersecurity, of course, is a very important thing. But there was no attempt to link together cyber and economics. I was struck when later on in 2010 the Her Majesty's government in Great Britain issued a national security strategy and essentially made the same mistake. It had quite a bit in there about cybersecurity, the potential threat to the Olympics, etc. But there was no effort made to link cyber to other parts of the society. And I was struck with this because a couple years before that, I was chairing a cyber war conference in London. And on the tube one afternoon, there was an interview with it was Gordon Brown, the British Prime Minister at the moment. And he was making a very strong argument that enhancing British cyber capabilities, enhancing the connectivity across British society, would have very, very strong positive effects on the British economy, on the British political society, etc., which I fundamentally am in violent agreement with. And yet, by the time you got to our national security strategy and the British one, those links went away, and I was disappointed in that. Next slide, Betty. I want to talk about the Russians here for 2 slides, and I don't know if there are any Russians in attendance or logged on. About 2 years ago, the Ministry of Defense published some guidelines for what I originally thought would originally have been translated as cyberspace, and that was incorrect. They were not talking specifically about cyber. They were talking about information. They laid out some key objectives, and not surprisingly, there has a strong military and national security flavor to it. Some of the objectives: restraining and averting and resolving conflicts in the infosphere. Their terminology is different from ours. The Russians have written extensively about information warfare, and to them, information warfare is the delivery of content to shape cognition, both inside the Russian Federation and elsewhere as well. The information space, all aspects of creating, using, influencing, the various aspects of the information infrastructure. It's a broader approach than we have taken. But to go to the next slide, Russian MOD overview. There are some principles there that I'm not going to spend any time on. I want to speak for a minute to the bottom bullet. The Russian Federation's armed forces will use maximum possibilities of the info space to defend the Russian Federation, to deter conflict, and shape the international system. The Russian Federation is paying a great deal of attention to information as an environment and how they can use that environment to best advantage. Next slide, national security strategists. This was a slide I created specifically for my students at NDU. And it applies equally to the senior students that Lars and Ingvar have back at the Forsvarets Högskolan in Stockholm, and other war colleges some of you may be affiliated with. The job of a war college, in my opinion, is not just to prepare experts in military strategy, but to prepare people who think about national security strategy and how we blend all the different elements of national power, diplomatic, informational, military, economic, the DON, how we blend those elements together to come up with national security. And so I always stress to my students at NDU that I was trying to prepare them to think about information as an element of national power and how they could best use it. Go to the next slide. Do we need more writings on land power? No, Napoleon did a pretty good job of writing about the art of war almost 200 years ago. Alfred Thayer Mahan did a pretty good job writing about sea power back around the turn of the 1900s. Gilles Douai, not quite 100 years ago, Command of the Air, wrote about air power. George Kennan, in the 1940s and in the 50s, writing about the sources of Soviet conduct, laid out an approach for a security strategy towards the Soviet Union. Even in the realm of the unthinkable, nuclear war, you had thinkers like Herman Kahn, who wrote on thermonuclear war. And of course, to wrap it all up, you had people, a few, like Karl von Clausewitz on war, who tried to take a broad, inclusive approach towards what is war and how does it fit in the modern, 200 years ago, nation-state system. But there's an unclaimed box there at the bottom. On cyber war, no one's written it yet. Someone, maybe it'll be me, maybe it'll be one of you, maybe one of your students, someday will put pen to paper and come up with a coherent theory for what cyber war is and what we're going to do with it. Okay, I promised to talk about education, so let me go to the first of the 3 slides on education. I'm going to suggest that we do very, very well in training and preparing information warriors. And that goes back to what I said earlier about command and control warfare. We prepare electronic warfare officers in all of our countries. We prepare psychological operations experts in all of our militaries. We are now preparing people expert in information assurance and cybersecurity. We do very well at the preparation of information warriors who can operate with and in some of those very specific niches of information war. We do pretty well now, better than we did 15 years ago, at preparing the information planners and the people that can take, build an information operations annex and put that into an overall operations plan. It is recognized by the American military as an indispensable piece of that operations plan. We're doing better at that. What we're not doing well at, and I think this is very serious, is we're not preparing information strategists. We're not preparing people who think about the synergies of information and how it blends with economics or diplomacy or politics and how it supports those other elements of national power and synergizes with them and makes everything more powerful. Okay, let's go to the next slide. Says information education. And here's some examples of why I worry. At the Army War College, about 2 to 2.5 years ago, up at Carlisle, Pennsylvania, they had a very active information operations element under Dennis Murphy. That element's gone. In a cost-cutting, cost-saving measure, the Army War College took its entire information operations entity and fired him. There's one officer that rotates in, and that officer has some degree of information operations background, but that's not the same as what Dennis had. At the Naval War College, Dick Kroll was there. They actually may have the best information operations presence right now. There's a fairly strong cyber expertise up there. We used to have the flagship at the National Defense University, and that's what I did there for 18 years. We took that School of Information Warfare that Wynn mentioned earlier. That was a year-long program, and after 2 years of that, we did away with it and formed an electives program, which I had the honor to run. The Information Strategies Concentration Program, and then for the last couple of years, the Information Operations Concentration Program, to emphasize information operations a little more strongly. However, that whole effort has been fragmented. Amy Zollman, who's a dear friend of mine, and she's an absolute expert when it comes to the soft dimensions of information and influence and psychological. And she's over at the National War College struggling to put information back into their curriculum. Over at the school that I was a part of, the now called the I College of the Information Resources Management College, the I College has picked up and taken the cyber piece, but they don't talk about cyber war. They talk about cybersecurity. And they talk about information assurance and information security. And so there's no one at NDU now who is approaching information as an element of national power on a broad, strategic sense, and trying to bring it. So let's go to the last slide. There's information education. Our colleges, our staff colleges and war colleges are based on domains. The services are based on domains. Air War College, Air Command Staff College, Army's Command and General Staff College at Fort Leavenworth. The job of the National Defense University is to cross those domains and to emphasize joint professional military education. We need that year-long approach now more than we needed it 10 years ago. But I'm not going to hold my breath, and I wouldn't suggest that you hold your breath waiting for it either. That's what we need to do. Okay, Betty, if you want to put the last slide, it has my my contact information. My email address is it's got my cell phone on it, which has been ringing here. I don't know who's calling me. And my last attempt to try to be humorous and suggest that we need to produce information strategists. That's our great need. I'm depending upon you guys to pick up the ball and carry it forward. When I'll be glad to try to answer any questions, or hopefully I've sparked some discussion that will go on for the rest of today and after that. I appreciate you giving me the opportunity to do this. I apologize. I am very sorry that I couldn't physically be there with you. I think all of you know, or some of you know, that I'm been for a year and a half now fighting pancreatic cancer. Being at the year and a half point is a miracle. That puts me in a very small slice, and so I'm fighting with every ounce I have. I appreciate you letting me do this today. This is a form of therapy for me. What questions can I answer?
Dan, thank you. Number one, I mean, that's tremendous. Thank you.
Thank you.
We're all behind you, support you. You know that, and we've all shed a tear upon occasion, and anything we can do along the way. But barring that, I have a question that I'm going to kick it off, and I know Lars has probably got a couple too. The distinction between strategy and tactics is something that in the private sector we deal with very heavily in the information security realm. Tactics you can teach. I maintain that strategy and big thinking is inherent. Can you really teach strategy the way that you're alluding, or do you have to find the right people with the right mindset first and then kind of form it?
I think both of those are true. Strategy is not as easy as tactics. Tactics are the things that military forces are the most comfortable with. Strategy is what we need, but I always found this uplifting and energizing at NDU was every year I had 5, 10 or 15 or 20 students who really wanted to dig into this and dive into it deeply and took the strategic part of this really to heart. What it really takes there is a faculty that supports them in this, and an institution that supports the faculty in trying to teach this and trying to enable students to look at this. So it cuts across the board. We need institutions that can support the faculty's efforts to enable and enhance the students to take this on. Because if you give them the chance, they will explore this.
Dave, I know you've been itching.
Hi there, Dan. My name's Dave Massell. I'm an alumnus of Royal Holloway's Information Security Group, MSc. There are, in fact, 3 of us in the room now. Question. You've said that we haven't got a definitive cyber definition of how to do the warfare. We had Timothy Taylor's brilliant presentations yesterday, which are not available remotely. Do you think there's a chance that that's already been written in Chinese?
Boy, I'll tell you what. The Chinese take everything that we have written very seriously, maybe take it too seriously. But I think over the past 15 years, we've seen a steady stream of things that get written in the United States, and 2 or 3 years later, it gets turned back into Chinese for their purposes. They're doing a very good job thinking about this and thinking about it strategically. If any of you come from a diplomatic background, you're aware that the Chinese have been on a charm offensive in several areas of the world, trying to establish strong relations and good relations with those countries that they see as sources of critical national resources that they need to tap into. So they understand the role that information can play in this, and they take it very seriously.
we've had the Chinese already send a panda to Scotland in advance of college separation. So thank you for your very astute comment.
Dan?
Yep.
Lars here. The eternal question I always been putting to you the last 10 years about the relations between information operations and cyber operations doctrinally, the JP 313 versus 312. What's your take today? Has 313 and the promoters of that lost the battle?
I feel strongly both ways. I think putting Cyber Command at the NSA was probably the right and logical thing to do, because there's such obvious synergies between the capabilities that the National Security Agency has and what Cyber Command is being tasked to do. So there's obvious reasons for putting it there. On the other hand, I think by putting it there, it has exacerbated and worsened the splitting apart of cyber from information operations. And the train that I see rolling down the track here in the United States military is not towards bringing cyber and info ops together. The train is the one that's pulling them farther apart, and that troubles me. That was the effort that I tried to make at NDU. Was I tried to drive students to think about the combining of those activities. I'm not sure anyone is doing that now. That, I think, is a problem.
Dan, you want to follow
Yep.
up?
No.
Hey, Dan, G. Mark Hardy. I'm a retired U.S. Navy captain. I kind of got run over by that train. My argument toward the end of my career was that InfoWar and CyberWar should not be a J2 function. It should be a J3 function. For those who
I agree.
3 being ops, 2 being intel. And I think what's happened is the ignorance and the arrogance of our senior officers, such that they don't understand it. They've flicked it onto the J2 saying, can you solve this puzzle? And J2 said, well, we think so. Well, how much manpower do you need? I don't know, 300 billets? You got them. I'm like, damn, we should ask for 500. The problem is we're not training our future generation of combatant commanders to think inside the wire. And we're going to take a hit sometime, and they're not going to know what to do. And we're going to delegate it to the analysts who are not trained to pull the trigger and make decisive combat decisions. And I think we're setting ourselves up for massive failure. Concur? Disagree, or what are your thoughts?
No, I'm in violent agreement with you. It's unfortunate. I wish I could disagree, but I think that's the train we're going. I think putting again the placement of Cyber Command at NSA, which obviously a great big huge intelligence organization, exacerbates that problem. And yeah, the intelligence world is glad to put their hand out there and say, here, we want to put 300 bodies in my. I'll take 500, sure. I think you put the nail right on the head of one of our problems. There is that we have the wrong people running this. It should not be the intel community. And I don't say that to denigrate the intelligence community. We can't fight and win without them. Neither can anybody else. Intelligence is an absolutely vital aspect of every form of military power. But it's not the same thing as that military power. I would agree with you that either ops or plans, or some places where ops and plans are co-joined, is where this ought to be. I'm not sure how many places do that.
And how do we get there from here without a catastrophe?
I don't know. I've heard too many people offer the advisory that it won't get better until we see a catastrophe, and by then, of course, it's a tad too late.
Unless we somehow need to inoculate our system, much like they do with a weakened vaccine, to help the human system do well, is it seditious to try to create some sort of a scenario that propels national decision makers to action in that direction, but without actually endangering national security? It's sort of a really, really thin line there.
In other words, you want to fuck it up so we react.
Yeah.
Well said, Wynn. I think we need another eligible receiver 97. Does the term eligible receiver 97 ring a bell with everyone there?
Oh, yeah.
That was an exercise that the joint world carried out in the United States 15 plus years ago of a cyber attack on ourselves, an information warfare attack on ourselves, which scared the bejesus out of a couple of military commands because it showed that that the emperor's clothes weren't there; they were naked. I think we need another one or two of those to point out some of the weaknesses and some of the problems before someone else points it out for us.
But that's almost like pointing out the hazards of cigarette smoking to a chain smoker. That's not going to cause the emotional, visceral change. It's only going to be an intellectual argument. There has to be an emotional change or stimulus before we make a system where people are going to let go of what they've made their successful career work on. And we keep
some of those anti-smoking campaigns, I think they had impact when they put people on the screen who were visibly and obviously suffering from the effects. You know, people who had no throat, no voice box, had lost half their face to cancer, etc. And they were making the strong personal case for, listen to me, I've been through this. Maybe we need to do the same thing with info ops and cyber.
Hi, I am Estonia. I've been hit. You know.
Yeah.
Yeah, and let me follow up with another question. But when you wrote JP3 1398, the quote there, the ultimate goal is the human decision making. Is there any part in the system where someone who has the center of gravity for thinking on the cognitive side and not just on ones and zeros? Is it a gypsy at the SOCOM, or where do you see that those things still existing?
I don't know how to answer that, Lars. Human behavior is the ultimate goal, because you want to affect how humans. It might be one human, it might be a billion of them, or some range in between there. You want to affect how they do things, how they think and make decisions and act. And so it's the human cognitive response result is the ultimate goal. I'm just not sure how we get there from here. Well, Wynn, this was a pleasure doing this. I appreciate you giving me the opportunity.
Thank you.
You've got my contact information there. I will take it as a mark of success if my email basket fills up the next couple of days with more questions.
And Dan, next year you're going to be here.
Hey, Wynn, I don't know whether Dan's able to do this, but one I'm trying to do at what'll be 4 o'clock your time is we're going to try to roll our own digital weapon. That's kind of what I'm going to be talking about, and not sure if you want to dial in and listen in or participate.
It's on YouTube Live.
It's on YouTube Live, okay. But can you
if I can, I will. Thank you. Thanks, Wynn.
Okay.
There's ways to do it. We can talk later. Yeah. Dan, thank you very much, and we'll talk soon. Be well.
I'm going to sign off now. Thanks, everybody.